So today we're going to talk a little bit about NFPA 101 Chapter 43, which actually has been around since the 2006 edition of the Life Safety Code, but we're now just starting to see it getting pulled into current codes because of CMS adopting the 2012 edition. So we're going to be talking about the 2012 edition and the ramifications of this new chapter. The one thing we'll find is that healthcare is probably going to be affected the least by this chapter because we already had been doing a lot of the stuff, and we're already compliant with existing chapter for the most part in all of our hospitals, thanks to CMS, Joint Commission, and the other deeming authorities. But still makes sense to go through it so you understand what the ramifications of this chapter are. So we'll take it step at a time here. Learning objectives, just to explain when Chapter 43 is applicable. Sorry about that. First slide. Define the different levels of building rehabilitation. Determine when new or existing chapter requirements are applied. And then when changes are not required due to technical infeasibility. So what did we do prior to Chapter 43? When you were doing a project met the new requirements. Whatever you were doing, you had to meet the requirements for a new construction for the applicable occupancy chapter. The existing building was supposed to already comply with the existing chapters, and you were just, I need renovations, we'll comply with the new. So that was what we did. It was assumed that everybody was compliant with NFPA chapters for the new for existing construction. That's probably pretty true for healthcare, again, because we have such continual oversight. Not so much true for many other occupancies. There's just lack of enforcement. There's a lot of business occupancies, a lot of assembly occupancies, a lot of mercantile occupancies out there that don't even comply with the existing chapters for that occupancy. And this chapter is kind of a tool to try to get those occupancies to comply with at least the existing chapters. So the goal of this chapter is to improve the existing life safety of a building without requiring all the rehabilitation work to comply with new requirements. It's kind of onerous to tell an owner, well, you want to do a small renovation, well, you got to bring the whole building up to new requirements, or even, a floor. So it's a kind of a stepped approach of how we upgrade the requirements for the building. It encourages the adaptive reuse of a building. So if it's going to be more cost-effective for me to just get on the street and build a new building, I'm going to do that and just abandon or sell the old building off. So the idea is to try to reuse existing buildings, but not be so onerous in doing so, and trying to work with the building owners, occupants, to try to upgrade the building step at a time. This concept was actually not developed by NFPA. It was actually developed by HUD back in 1997, and it was originally designed as kind of a model to be used by the other model code agencies. ICC, NFPA first started using this in the development of their NFPA 5000 building code. And then it started there and then got pulled into NFPA 101. So basically, the chapter breaks down the types of projects that you're going to be doing in a building to these categories: repair, renovation, modification, reconstruction, change of use or change of occupancy, and an addition. We're going to go through each one of these and kind of explain what the differences are and what the levels are and what requirements are required. So repair. This is pretty basic stuff that we do every day in a hospital. Patching, restoration, painting of materials, elements, equipment, or fixtures for purpose of maintaining such materials, elements, equipment, or fixtures in good or sound condition. Renovation. The replacement in kind, strengthening, or upgrading of building elements, materials, equipment, or fixtures that does not result in a reconfiguration of the building spaces within. So you have repair, which is just kind of like fixing a wall or fixing a door, some small minimal stuff. One step up is renovation. You're doing more, but you're still not reconfiguring a space. And we'll get into each one of these in a little bit more detail. The next level is modification. That's when we reconfigure a space. The addition, relocation, or elimination of any door or window. The addition or elimination of any load-bearing elements. The reconfiguration or extension of any system or the installation of any additional equipment. All those are considered modification. Reconstruction is basically modification, but it starts involving the space that affects an exit corridor or means of egress, where the project renders the means of egress inoperative or unusable. Some general requirements for the whole chapter. Any building undergoing repair, renovation, modification, reconstruction must comply with both the existing chapter for the applicable occupancy. So for healthcare, it would have to be compliant with Chapter 19. If you were assembly, you would have to comply with existing Chapter 13. Business, existing Chapter 39. And then you would comply with the applicable requirements from Chapter 43, which we're going to identify and talk about as repair, renovation, modification. Any building undergoing change of use or change of occupancy must comply with Section 43.7. A building undergoing an addition must comply with 43.8. And then historical buildings, there's a separate chapter on that. And we're not going to get into that deeply, but we'll just kind of touch on what your options are there. So you can have a project in the building that involves two different levels of modification or rehab. You can have a repair and a modification at the same time, and they can be treated as separate projects, and each, following their separate rules. And each one, like I said, each one must comply with the respective category. Where a modification or a reconstruction are performed in the same or contiguous areas, the project must comply with reconfiguration. The only exception to that is if the reconstruction portion is less than 10% of the modification area. And I know this is all just talk. So, for instance, here on the left, you can see that the green represents a modification to a space. They're reconfiguring the floor plan, adding doors, moving some walls. And then over on the left, you can see that small area. They're redoing something in the corridor, exit corridor. So that's a reconfiguration. So you got a modification and a reconstruction project. They're treated separate. On the right, you can see the modification process is contiguous with the renovation in the exit corridor. Therefore, the whole thing is treated as a reconfiguration project. Does that make sense? I want to encourage anybody who has questions to please, I hate to just sit up here and lecture. I'd love to have some interaction if anybody has questions. So. Reconstruction, basically, whenever it involves a means of egress. So if you're renovating a corridor, that's when reconfiguration triggers. Okay, and we're going to talk more about that specifically. Yeah. There's never a square in the life safety codes. There's never a square foot. There's percentage numbers that will kick in for certain things, but not under the definitions.
What if you have an existing condition like 7-5 corridor, and you're going to be doing reconstruction, but it's so costly, moving columns and everything? How does that apply?
Hold that thought until the question is, a corridor that's not compliant. How does that come into play? And we'll kind of talk about that under the reconfiguration.
Is there a gray area for modifying doors in the same place, or if you change the door out, just a swap or equal?
Pretty much swapping out, but again, we'll get to that one too. I don't want to jump ahead. So I ask for questions and I tell you I'll hold them. So sorry. So the code still permits alternative means, methods, equipment, which are permitted to use under Chapter 4.1 of NFPA 101. So basically, if you can come in with an equivalency that meets the same level of protection that the AHJ is okay with, you can always do that for Chapter 4 of Life Safety Code. Also, where compliance is technically infeasible, and they give the definition there of technically infeasible, I'm not going to read it. This will be posted to the ASHE website for download too. So, but basically, it gives the AHJ the authority to evaluate when there is a technical infeasibility. Again, moving columns to try to make a corridor 8 foot that's not 8 foot today, stuff like that. So there is a way that the AHJ has the ability to kind of evaluate that and say, that's crazy. We can't physically, or we guess we can physically, but cost effectively we cannot make this comply with the current code. So let's come up with something we can all accept. Where an existing building exceeds requirements for new construction and not part of a previously approved alternative plan, modifications are permitted so long as it meets the requirement for new construction. So for an example, I've got an existing hospital with an area that's got a 12-foot corridor. I'm modifying the area. How far down can I take that? Any guesses? I mean, existing chapter says I keep it at 4 feet, right? But the code says that I can never reduce it down if I already have in excess of what's required for new. I can't take it down to what's less than new. So I would have a 12-foot corridor. I could take it down to 8 foot because that's what is required for new. So, does that make sense? So any work that's required by the accessibility, property, housing, or fire code is not required to meet Chapter 43 unless the code requiring it stipulates that. So if somebody comes in and does an accessibility study in your building, you're found that you're in violation of some accessibility requirements, you would have to make those modifications to comply with accessibility, but none of Chapter 43 would come into play there. Only the accessibility requirements would have to be met, unless you start getting into modifying a lot of square footage. But the AHJ may have a problem with that. But generally, if it's required by another code, it doesn't kick you into this code and start trigger other things. All right, so talking about each one of these in a little bit more detail. I already read the definition. Some examples. So I've got stained ceiling tiles. I'm replacing that. It's basically fixing, patching, replacing, just to keep your building looking nice and working order. The code for under repair requires you to use like material. So if I have a piece of wallpaper that doesn't meet today's code, or even today's code for existing, but I still have a piece of that up in my attic stock, I'm allowed to use that, even though it doesn't meet new code or existing code. I'm just replacing it in kind, I can do that. Now, if I don't have that, and I have to replace that with something, I at least have to meet existing code. You must never reduce and this is a common theme throughout this whole chapter, you can never reduce the level of compliance to less than it was before you started. You've always got to at least maintain this. We're stepping it up, but you never drop down.
And we've also noticed a real disparity between the local and state authority surveys and our accreditations. So that's something that we're really trying hard to work to address. And how we're doing that is by looking at the validations they have and figuring out how we can bring our survey process closer.
If you're using Chapter 43, that's what it says you're allowed to do.
And we've done that actually with infection prevention. So some of those standards we're working on right now with safety.
Yeah, again, and the question is, in case you can't hear the back, he understands you've got a piece of wallpaper that you've got attic stock, you replace it in kind. But if you don't, you have to go back, and I'm saying per the code, you're allowed to use an existing chapter or existing building requirements for the interior finish. What AHJ is going to permit that? Well, the idea here is that, again, in the past it was always you meet existing, anything you do meets new. This is the whole premise of this chapter is that depending on what the level is, we're going to require more and more. So if it's something this minor, we're going to let you just do, use existing in kind if we have it, or at least meet existing requirements. But one of the other provisions of this code also says you have to comply with NFPA, you have to comply with the existing chapter. There's a lot of buildings. I'm not saying it in hospitals. Hospitals, we're in pretty good shape. There's a lot of buildings out there that don't meet existing requirements. And this is a tool that the building official could say, fine, you want to use that? Your building has to meet existing requirements. A renovation, so that takes it to the next level. All right, so here it's not just a replacing or repairing something, but I'm replacing the ceiling tiles throughout this room, or I'm replacing the carpet throughout the room. I'm replacing a bunch of toilets in a bathroom, not just one for one. Okay. Here it says you must, all new work must comply with requirements for existing construction. Not new, existing. Again, must not reduce the level of compliance to anything below what it was before. There is a provision here that says allows a minor reduction in door widths as long as it's approved by the AHJ. So for instance, if I have a door that I'm replacing and it ends up replacing it to a clear width of 32 inches. It was greater than that, but now it's down to 32 because of the door that I'm replacing it with. The AHJ may say, that's fine, I can still get a wheelchair through that door. But if it goes down to like a 30-inch opening, now he's going to say, no, that's not acceptable because I can't even get a wheelchair through there. So, again, it's up to the AHJ. Under renovation, the means of egress capacity must be compliant with Chapter 7, the requirements in Chapter 7. There are two exceptions. The AHJ is permitted to establish an actual occupant load. So, say I have an assembly occupancy that, by calculations, it has an occupant load of 300 people. But my egress capacity doesn't meet that. The AHJ can come in and say, well, my actual occupant load is only 250 and we meet that egress capacity. We just have to have a provision in place that maintains or keeps that occupancy from exceeding the maximum allowable. The other exception is that a previously approved egress plan that was approved by the AHJ is allowed to be maintained. Under renovation, interior finishes require the interior finishes to meet the requirement for new. So that's where your question. So if it's just a repair, it's one thing. If I'm replacing this room, if I'm replacing this whole room, now I do need to meet the requirement for interior finish for new construction. Everything else pretty much is existing, but interior finishes has to meet new. So if I reconfigure or extend any system or add any new equipment, that portion of that project, it still may be a renovation, but that portion of that project has to meet the requirements for modification. Because if you look at modification, the definition of it is extension of a system, addition of a system.
Suppose you put in a new piece of radiation equipment, contaminated, for example. It requires a secondary trench for voltage instead of the original. Everything's staying the same, except you have to add this trench. Is that going to fall under modification?
That would fall under modification, probably. Yeah. But again, you'll see when we get to modification, it's still not excessive. It's still not, there's still some allowances they give you because it's an existing building. Again, the same theme. Use of this chapter requires that the building comply with the existing applicable chapter. Okay, so modification, we read the definition. We don't need to rehash that. All new work must comply with new construction. It's not requiring, upgrade of areas, but all the new work must comply with new construction. Again, building must be compliant with NFPA the applicable NFPA occupancy chapter. So if you've got extensive modifications. Modifications of an entire building or an entire occupancy within a building must be considered as reconstruction, which we'll touch on next, and shall comply with the requirements of reconstruction for the applicable chapter or applicable occupancy chapter. The exception for that is that modification work that is exclusively electrical, plumbing, mechanical, fire protection, or structural work is not considered reconstruction regardless of the extent.
The code sets that they put out it. And then we do also
Question?
dates for the revised standards. As I've said, we don't expect a survey for 2012 editions until November 1st, which is when the city school survey. But ASCs are expected to comply effective July. And then there's a requirement for building hazardous areas that doesn't take effect until July 5th, 2017.
That's possible if that it makes economical sense to do it that way, sure.
A gray area of sorts with different dates coming into play.
Chapter 43, right, correct.
How to assess for compliance.
Did you ever hear that question in the back? So his question is, so an architect submits a package to an AHJ, and it's going to have multiple packages. Some of it will be modification, some of it will be renovation, some of it will be reconstruction. And yes, that's exactly true. That's an option you have using Chapter 43.
There will be revised definitions for existing and new, as I'm sure you all know. There's brought in, talking about buildings having, what was it?
Prior approval documents or started construction?
Great. And that brings us to Bill.
Boy, you
Remember
fast.
back here that
Any questions
Under
before I step off the podium about the
renovation, reconfiguration, extension of a system, with the installation of additional equipment must comply with modification. So if it's additional, or extending it, or reconfiguring it, then it's a modification. If it's just replacing in kind, it's renovation.
I'll do that right now.
Okay, great. And that CMS is basically giving organizations.
Another extension modification, where the total area of the work areas included in the modification exceed 50% of the area of the building, the work shall be considered as a reconstruction and shall comply with requirements of reconstruction for the applicable occupancy. Again, this does not apply for work that is exclusively plumbing, mechanical, fire protection, electrical. That stuff that is not included in the calculation of the 50%. Does that make sense? I kind of started that wrong. So any of the mechanical MEP work is not considered in that 50% calculation when you're trying to determine that level of work.
Basically created before we acquired HVAC. It's a subsidiary called.
Okay, reconstruction is where we start to get
It's
the
a hospital sister.
more serious requirements. And again, that's when it's a reconfiguration of a space, but also involves an egress corridor, means of egress, and also it can be where modification, there's the last section, kick you over into a reconstruction.
So we just replace the A acronym with a different A.
So under reconstruction, the means of egress must comply with the requirements for the applicable existing occupancy as modified. The following modifications apply. So the illumination, emergency lighting, and marking of means of egress in a reconstruction area must meet new construction requirements of the applicable occupancy. So if I've got a reconstruction project and I'm redoing the egress corridor, I have to meet the requirements for emergency lighting, illumination, and the marking exit signage for new construction.
When we looked at the overall philosophy.
Where a reconstruction is greater than 50% of a floor area, it applies to the entire floor. So if I've got a 30,000 square foot floor plate that I'm modifying, and I'm doing work in the corridors, I'm doing 20,000 square feet of it I'm renovating, I would have to do the exit corridors would have to comply throughout that entire floor, because it's more than 50% of that floor. Where a reconstruction is greater than 50% of the aggregate floor area of the building, it also applies all exiting serving the rehab area. So if I'm doing something on level 2, the stairs going down to egress, or down to exit, would also have to comply with the lighting requirements. This does not apply to like a tenant space within a renovated area. So if you had some tenant space that it's in that 20,000 square foot, you wouldn't have to upgrade the egress lighting and emergency lighting there.
Hello, so yes, it does say 2015.
If the occupancy, only if the existing chapter requires the separation. There is some requirements for smoke barriers and
Which makes this really
fire and smoke barriers, but it's only in a couple occupancies, basically dwelling units. Small board and care and 1 and 2 family dwellings, where the work is in any attached dwelling unit, the walls separating dwelling units must be continuous from foundation to the roof. We're not going to see much of this in healthcare, maybe some residential board and care if people are working in that. But what that basically says is you're allowed to make those changes on the side that's being renovated. And if there's like an area you can't access between a floor, the ceiling of one floor and the floor of the next, that space doesn't have to, you can leave that space without having to add additional walls. So here's where it really kicks in. This chapter really probably has the meat of the matter. Where rehab involves greater than 50% of an aggregate floor area of a building, automatic sprinklers must be provided on the highest floor of rehab work and all floors below in accordance with new construction for the applicable occupancy. And that's important that it says applicable occupancy. So if you're doing work in a business occupancy, and that business occupancy, it's a non-high-rise business occupancy, and that chapter doesn't require sprinklers, still wouldn't require sprinklers. If you're doing work in a hotel, and the new requirements would require sprinklers, then this would kick in. Where rehab involves 50% of a floor area, automatic sprinklers must be provided throughout that floor in accordance with new construction for applicable occupancy. So if I'm doing more than 50% of a building, I have to do from that floor that I'm rehabbing all the way down. If I'm doing more than 50% of a floor, I have to do that whole floor. Make sense?
Question for you on the last one. Sprinklers and elevator hoistways and machinery rooms. Does that meet with the elevator code?
So what the,
Might have more than one fire marshal and elevator code inspector who knows the knows. Code.
yes. So what this is saying is that if one of these sprinkler projects that gets triggered results in sprinklers being installed in an elevator, hoistway, or machine room, you must meet the requirements of firefighter emergency operations as required by A17.1, which is new construction. So phase 1 recall and phase 2 firefighter operations would be required for the elevator.
Just like I said, the construction, I've had an elevator inspector say, no, you're not putting that in.
Well, yeah, can't answer that. I'm not sure who wins that battle. It's on a case-by-case basis. Generally, you're supposed to. Basically, you want to meet the life safety code, but if your elevator inspector says, I'm not giving you an elevator permit unless you do it my way, you're kind of stuck. So here's an example of what I was just talking about. So on the left, here's a hotel. I'm renovating the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floor. It's more than 50% of the building. So it results in me sprinkling the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floor. All right. Similarly, I'm renovating the more than 50% of the 3rd floor. I would have to sprinkle the entire 3rd floor. Standpipe systems in a rehab or in a reconstruction project where it's required to be provided with standpipes by the applicable occupancy chapter, and there's not that many in 101 actually. It must be provided with a standpipe up to the highest floor undergoing rehab. That's, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's pretty much a high-rise building. So if you're doing a renovation in a high-rise building, it's going to require you to provide standpipes up to that floor. But you also need to make provisions. I said here, there's no pump required where the standpipe meets certain conditions. Basically, the fire department can provide a certain pressure at that highest point, and you design it to go further when you do the design. and in non-high-rise buildings, the required for interconnection of wet stand pipes can occur on the rehab floor. Fire alarm systems. Basically, this pretty much applies to mostly dwelling units, anywhere where you have dwelling units. Lodging, rooming houses, hotels, dormitories, apartment buildings require smoke alarms in individual sleeping rooms, guest rooms, and dwelling units complying with new construction within the rehab area. I knew that was coming up. Yeah, and again, remember, this is smoke alarm, not smoke detector. Anyone would tell me the difference between a smoke alarm and a smoke detector?
All smoke alarm, smoke system, they all have to be tied together, or they all go on? One's in all, the other one's in those.
So a smoke detector is part of a smoke alarm, fire alarm system. So we all have our smoke detectors in our hospital, outside the elevator lobby, the doors on hold open, whatever. A smoke alarm, by definition, is what we have in our house. It's something that's battery operated, electrically operated. It sounds when that device goes off. It's not going back to a panel and then setting off on this alarm system. So what that does is I know how many people have put a smoke detector and then put a horn strobe in their on-call unit. And every time the fire alarm system goes off, the doctors are screaming because that thing's going off. There's a way around that. You can just use a regular smoke alarm, or you can put a sounder base under the smoke detector so that when that detector goes off, that alarm goes off. But anyway, that's the difference between a smoke alarm and a smoke detector. And what on-call rooms are basically treated as a residential dwelling space and therefore require a smoke alarm. Residential board and care and one and two family dwellings require smoke alarms complying with new construction within the rehab area. In a high-rise building where the work is on one floor or one entire floor or 20% or more of the occupied floor area of the building, all floors shall be accessible by at least one elevator. I don't know, there's too many hospitals out there that don't already have elevators, so probably not a problem we're going to run into. But. So here's a kind of a summary chart of what the work is on the left, the section that identifies it or addresses it, the features that are changed or not changed, and the features that are added or changed. So basically, under repair, everything stays existing. Under renovation, anything new is pretty much existing except for new interior finishes, which are new. And then modification and reconstruction, your features that are added or aren't new. All right? Does that kind of give everybody a little bit more comfort on those levels now? Next, we're going to go to change of use and change of occupancy. So anyone care to define what's the difference between the two? A change of use is something that stays within the same occupancy. So I'll use a great example for healthcare. If I've got a patient room that I want to now use for storage, that's a change of use. It's not a change of occupancy. It's still a I2 occupancy, but it's a change of use. Change of occupancy, obviously, is where you change the type of use of the building or the occupancy of the building. So you go from an assembly to a mercantile or mercantile to business or whatever. A change of use that does not involve change of occupancy class must comply with the provisions for existing construction in the new area unless the change creates a hazardous content. So the change of use must meet the new construction requirements for the applicable new use where you have a hazardous area. There is an exception, is one that it's good for healthcare, that if you have a room that you're converting to a storage room and it's less than 250 square feet, it just needs to meet the requirements for smoke tight and sprinklered with a self-closing door. No rating. So you've got that room that needs to be storage. It's sprinklered. You've got a self-closing door. It's less than 250 square feet. You can use this provision. It has to have positive latching. Yeah. That's the 193212 and 193213. What's that? It's just under NFPA 101, a ceiling can be your smoke enclosure.
If there was fire marshal.
All right, that question?
So it doesn't fall under, it doesn't fall under new hazardous area, so greater than 100 square feet, it would be now rated.
If you're using these provisions of Chapter 43, that's correct.
So if it's less than 250, where do we, is that less than 250 is in 43?
Chapter 43, under change of use. Chapter 43.7, change of use.
So it would have to be like after July 5th.
After July 5th, correct. Or
What if you're lowering that in your, like say you're converting a set of labs into business?
you're going down in occupancy, you're taking a hazardous area away. There'd be no requirements for that. I mean, you could leave it rated, but it doesn't have to be anymore. Only if it's hazardous. So basically this is saying that if you have a change of use, you have to meet the applicable existing requirements, except for if you're creating a hazardous area. Then you have to meet new, except if you're healthcare, less than 250 square feet, then you can meet existing.
Does that also, then the classification of hazard play into that, like ordinary hazard or light hazard? But high hazard, wouldn't you still have to go back and?
Again, it's going to depend on the applicable occupancy chapter. For instance, business doesn't define it as specifically as healthcare does. So you would have to look at what is the occupancy, the surrounding occupancy under business, and what's the occupancy of the use. If it's deemed to be hazardous, then you would have to treat it as new construction. Anything else? All right, so change of occupancy is the next item. That's where you're going from, like, say, a mercantile to assembly or something like that. And the way that this addresses the change of occupancy, it classifies the different occupancies into hazard categories. So an industrial storage occupancy with the low hazard contents is assigned to number 4, your number 4 category. Number 3 has most of the most occupancies in there. Excuse me, question?
What is the cutoff date on the 2012 code from existing to new?
I believe it will be July 5th because that's the date that the CMS will has adopted.
That would be considered existing.
Anything prior to July 5th would be considered existing. Right.
As in permanent,
That's going to depend on some of the state agencies, what they determine, but yeah.
where it's out in the pipe. Yeah. So where it's out in the pipe.
Under construction prior to, it was designed and play it safe and just say it was built after.
Is there an annex to this code about keeping good relations with your HSJ?
So category 3 is the bulk of the occupancy chapters. Assembly, business, mercantile. Then you jump to hazard category 2. It's ambulatory healthcare, detention and correction, residential board and care. And if you think about that category 2 is basically people that can't get out and leave on their own. They're dependent on other people for self-preservation. And then highest hazard is an industrial occupancy that's high hazard. So basically it says if you go from the same hazard to a lower, from one that's 2 categories that are the same category, 2 occupancies of the same category, or you go to a lower one, you just have to comply with the existing chapter requirements for the applicable occupancy. Requirements for automatic sprinklers, fire detection alarm, communication systems in hazardous areas must comply with applicable new construction requirements in the new occupancy chapter you're going to. So if I'm going from, say, business to assembly, business didn't require sprinklers, assembly does because of my occupant load, I'm going to have to apply with new requirements for the sprinkler systems, but the rest of the occupancy would have to meet existing. A change from the same hazard category to a lower, which includes an assembly occupancy, in the example I just gave you, Um, It's basically the same thing. It just adds the requirement that assembly occupancy also has to meet the requirements for the main entrance exit. There's specific requirements that for certain assembly occupancies, you have to meet certain percentage of your egress capacity through your main entrance exit. So that also comes into play if you have an assembly occupancy in your change.
So, when you think about new and existing with chapter 43, like the sill height, the 36, or whatever, if you're doing a renovation, then again, by 43, you wouldn't have to change the sill heights because you're following the existing chapter, right?
If under reconstruction back a little bit ago, yes, you would follow, well, under your, the renovated area would have to meet new construction, under reconstruction.
So you have to raise the window heights in that newly constructed area.
But not elsewhere, right? So basically, if you go from a category, a lower category to a higher category, so if I'm going from a business to a healthcare, I have to meet the requirements for new construction for that occupancy. Anytime I go from a lower to a higher. Additions, basically increasing the aggregate area of the building area, the number of stories, or the building height. So I'm adding a building that's either increasing it horizontally or vertically. The addition must comply with the applicable new construction requirements for the applicable occupancy. The existing building must comply with the existing construction requirements. The rehabilitation within the existing buildings must comply with the applicable sections of 43. So if I add a new building and it involves some modifications or renovations in the existing building, depending on what level they are, they would have to follow the chapter 43, repair, renovation, modification, reconstruction. The addition cannot increase the height of an existing building beyond that permitted under the applicable new construction requirements.
So in that statement, you have a vertical expansion. The original facility was not considered high-rise construction. The addition then puts you into high-rise construction. You look at your existing building and your, let's say, your elevator, foyer area. The high-rise code would require protection of the elevator, foyer under high-rise code. Would that then state that you would not have to do that on the floors below the existing?
Again, assuming you meet that last bullet point, that construction, the type of construction that you're using meets the requirement for that, I would say that that's correct. The new addition, vertical addition, would have to meet new construction. The existing below would have to at least meet existing. That would be my guess without digging into that any further.
Because you can make the argument because that's a fairly expensive
It is.
cost to deal with the high-rise code and the impact with, and then I would bring up, what about the fire alarm system? If the existing fire alarm system is not high-rise, but yet you go to high-rise code, then wouldn't you have to run a station the floor below?
Fire alarm is probably going to get a little different because you have to have one system in the building, and if you start mixing, that's going to be difficult to do. And the other piece of the puzzle here is your officer going to have to, in most jurisdictions, have to deal with a building code that may have other requirements beside this. However, the question, I don't know if you heard in the back, is if I have an existing hospital that's not high-rise and I make a vertical addition that now qualifies as a high-rise, does that mean that the existing below can stay existing and the new construction above would meet new? And as an example of an issue, would the elevator foyers have to be added to the floors below? And by reading this, I would say they would not. But again, you may have other issues with a building code in your applicable area that may supersede that. Again, most building codes, like The ICC writes the International Building Code, but there's also the International Existing Building Code, which is very similar to this chapter here. It uses a lot of stepped progressions. The more renovation you do, the more compliance is required.
So your AHJ still has some latitude whether or not they decide to review under 43 at all?
Well, if the code's adopted, the question is, does the AHJ have the latitude to say yes or no?
In a major expansion where you have a huge addition that also has renovation back into the existing building, can they basically decide to just call it new and existing and not? I'm wondering how much latitude they have to just not review it under 43, which gets you some latitude in a lot of existing versus new issues on where you tie into the systems and all kinds of things.
I mean, the question is, can the building official not allow you to use 43 and basically force you into more restrictive requirements? I think whenever you do a large project, you want to work with your HJ. But the whole premise of this chapter is that, yes, if you follow all the, this and that, and cross your T's, dot your I's, yeah, you should be able to use Chapter 43 for that. Again, you're going to work with your AHJ. He may have a problem with one thing here or another thing there, and you just say, you know what, we'll comply with new for that.
When I go back to my earlier questions, I'm just trying to understand the advantage of it. I mean, if the new code requires 36-inch sill height, right? But you're gonna do one patient room, just renovate a patient room, bring it up, finishes, maybe change the toilet stuff, but it's an existing room that has a sill height of 42. Will we have to then just change that sill height in that one room that we're renovating?
So basically, it's a modification, right? Because you're
Well, put a new toilet in, changing wall colors,
that's probably just a renovation then. And then, so no, would not. If you're not moving walls, you're not changing doors, then it's just a renovation, and no, you would not have to. I apologize. I thought you meant like you're redoing on floor, multiple rooms, then it's a modification, and then the modification has to meet new.
So you have a wing that's, 14 rooms you're doing, on the one side, and you're doing 8 of those rooms, and all the sills would have to be.
Well, if you're doing 8 rooms, but you're not changing any walls, you're not changing any doors, you're not changing any windows, if it meets the definition of renovation, you just have to meet the requirements of the renovation chapter, which would mean finishes have to meet new requirements, but everything else can meet existing.
That makes sense.
Does that make sense? Fire protection systems. Other than 1 and 2 family dwelling, existing compartment areas without an approved separation from the addition shall be protected by an approved automatic sprinkler system, where the combined areas would be required to be sprinkled under new. Again, that's only for 1 and 2 family dwellings, and that's they threw that in there so that if there's a garage that's not attached, it wouldn't trigger that. Where an addition is made to a 1 or 2 family dwelling or a small residential board and care occupancy, interconnected smoke alarms powered by the electrical system are required in the addition. Historic buildings. Basically, this chapter, I'm summarizing in this one slide. You can comply with Section 4310, which is the historic chapter. You can comply with sections 43.3, 43.4, 43.5, 45.6 that we just reviewed, the repair, renovation, modification, reconstruction. Or you can go to NFPA 914, which is a whole standard for the protection of historic structures, and you can follow those requirements. So when you get into historic buildings, I didn't feel like had a lot of time to go into detail here today. So, but they do give you options here on what codes you want to follow. You can either just follow 4310, which has historic requirements. You can just call it, I'm not going to worry about it, and just follow the repair, reconstruction, modification options. Yeah. 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 So, yeah, your local historic board's going to have some words about that. So, well, we've been having questions. We did get started a little early, so we have a little extra time. But more questions?
Well, this probably more of a going on rabbit hole or something. If this 43, if you're doing the renovations and meet all the requirements, does it point you to the 245, NFPA 245 with construction? We're struggling with the 1 hour barrier.
241?
Or 241. We're struggling with that requirement for 1 hour barriers now, and just how much we get into that.
Whether it's sprinklered on both sides or not? Yeah, that's a discussion for another day. We don't have enough time to talk about that one. There's a lot of opinions on that one. So. Any other questions? No?
In regards to reconstruction versus modification, so in the sense of determining between the two, does temporary partitions that would affect egress or open counted towards converting from modification to reconstruction, or just doing temporary partitions for effective prevention purposes as well?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that one, because you're technically affecting the egress corridor? Temporarily. Again, that might be up to your HJ, whether or not that would fall into reconstruction or that would still be just a modification. The good thing, again, with hospitals is those two chapters aren't really going to make that much of a difference because a lot of us are already sprinklered and have the fire alarms and stuff like that reconstruction triggers. Anything else? I didn't get it in time, so I'll get it to them and they'll put it on the ASHI website. All right. Thank you. Yeah.